polluters from getting government contracts, Bureau of Land Management's corporate exclusions list. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking member, or their designees. This will allow us to hear from witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to make an opening statement. By law, the federal government cannot give companies contracts or agreements if they refuse to meet their legal environmental cleanup obligations or don't otherwise conduct their business with the government responsibly. That is the basic principle behind the suspension and disbarment list. It protects taxpayers from incompetent, ill-intentioned, and irresponsible companies. If a business violates the law, the federal government is required to consider suspension and disbarment and weigh various mitigating factors. The law is intended to prevent additional abuse by denying bad actors additional contracts and agreements. A federal exclusion list is kept on a public official government website, sam.gov, and it tracks people and companies that have proved to be bad actors based on their prior business practices. Federal officials rely on this list to prevent agencies from doing business with companies that have been suspended or debarred from receiving federal contracts. The Department of Interior's nonpartisan watchdog recently investigated the Bureau of Land Management agency. This agency awards leases to oil and gas companies to drill on our public lands. The investigation examined whether the Bureau was properly reviewing the list of exclusions before they accepted a company's bid to drill on public lands. It turns out they were not. The watchdog found that the Bureau failed to follow the law, which requires policies and procedures to ensure the exclusion lists are checked. The Bureau did not have policies and procedures in place to prohibit companies from securing contracts, and according to the watchdog, no one even seemed to know the list existed. When an employee brought it to the attention of Bureau management, nothing happened. No one wrote the policies. No one asked more questions. When the Inspector General, the watchdog, recommended how to bring the Bureau into compliance, the Bureau said it would take up to 2 years to implement the changes. I decided to investigate. And when I did, the Bureau got moving. It satisfied 2 of the 3 outstanding recommendations in weeks rather than years. It set in motion a major project to determine whether any of the bad actors they had caught in recent years should be on the government-wide list on sam.gov. Their parent agency, Interior, also started the process of looking at other parts of the department by compiling lists of programs that need to check the exclusion list and making sure that they have people in charge of making that happen. I commend the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Interior for taking this responsibility seriously. I am grateful in particular for the Interior Department's Inspector General. As the chair of this oversight committee, I strongly support your work to prevent waste and abuse at the Department of the Interior. As a result of your investigation, Interior has created a better internal system to prevent taxpayer dollars from being directed to companies identified as bad actors. When I started digging into the issues, I went beyond the Inspector General's watchdog report, and I found more. Companies that repeatedly pollute our public lands are still allowed to keep doing business with the government. ExxonMobil, who's the single largest federal leaseholder, has racked up 110 separate instances of misconduct since 1995, totaling $3.3 billion in penalties. ExxonMobil is not on the exclusion list. Today, I want to better understand why. Is it because Exxon is hiding its misdeeds by playing a corporate shell game with its subsidiaries? Or are repeat corporate offenders slipping through the cracks because there are only 2 people working in the Suspension and Disbarment Office at Interior, assisted by another 4 from the Office of Inspector General? While the Interior Department gives out tens of billions of dollars in grants, contracts, loans, and leases. Are bad actors evading detection? Because the Bureau of Land Management is trying to track them using names and addresses that companies can easily change. Or is the database out of date or in need of better technology? There are still too many ways to avoid accountability. It is clearly not in the taxpayer's best interest to keep giving money to polluters. That's why the law prohibits it. Honest, responsible industry players should not lose out on government business to unethical actors. Exclusion rules help law-abiding contractors they help protect law-abiding contractors, taxpayer dollars, the environment, and our public health. But they need strong, diligent regulators to do their job and prevent corporate abuse of taxpayers. I would now like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Moore, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair and witnesses. Look forward to your testimony and for an opportunity to ask several questions today. So thank you for being here. The Biden administration's policies are wreaking havoc on our nation. At every turn, Americans are forced to confront with crisis after crisis. Let's start with the border. U.S. Customs and Border Protection just reported that June was the 4th consecutive month of encountering more than 200,000 migrants at the southern border. June also saw inflation hit 9.1%, setting a 40-year record. Americans' pocketbooks are being hit as the economic crisis drives the costs for all aspects of day-to-day life, from food to rent to car to insurance. We've just hit 2 quarters of negative GDP growth as well. A key contributor to rising inflation rates is the energy crisis caused by President Biden's policies. As gas prices remain high, it is time for us to take our energy security into our own hands and responsibly develop our domestic natural resources. This subcommittee should be examining how to solve this administration's self-imposed crisis for Americans who are paying for all these bad policies. In our April hearing, I highlighted the link between the border crisis and the opioid crisis, and the witnesses were great that day in talking about how that really hits their communities, in particular in some of those areas. President Biden's flawed border policies are allowing dangerous drugs like fentanyl to flow into our communities. Today, we should highlight the energy crisis and propose solutions to lessen the burden on American families' budgets. Let's use the Bureau of Land Management as an example, since we're joined by Mr. Ned as a witness today. This administration should be forced to explain why BLM is failing to hold quarterly lease sales and issue applications for permits to drill in a timely manner. Both are key factors in our ability to domestically produce energy. Or we could focus on individual projects Democrats are obstructing. For example, in my home state of Utah, the administration has slowed the advancement of the Uinta Basin Railway. The Utah delegation, as well as state, local, and tribal officials, support the project, which will inject capital and stability into a crucially important rural community in my home state. But Democrats from outside my state continue to place obstacles in the way of its completion. By providing an alternative to trucking crude oil, the railway represents a vital piece of infrastructure for the safe and efficient transportation of our state's energy and agricultural resources. Whether it is through national policies or derailment of local projects, the Biden administration continues to hamper our nation's ability to produce energy here at home. Yet today, we are discussing a report from the Interior Department's Officer of Inspector General. An inspection revealed the BLM employees were unaware of their requirement to consult the federal exclusions list when issuing mineral leases. The Inspector General uncovered a long-standing failure at the BLM. In 2010, a solicitor's opinion determined mineral leases were subject to suspension and disbarment regulations. The Interior Department, however, did not issue department-level policies requiring that employees consult the federal exclusions list prior to issuing a lease until 2015. Even worse, the Inspector General found BLM failed to implement agency-level policies addressing the solicitor's determination. Ultimately, the Inspector General provided 4 recommendations to address the highlighted failure. BLM took an important first step this month By issuing an instruction memorandum, all employees are now on notice of the requirement to consult the federal exclusions list when granting mineral leases. We can all agree that these issues uncovered by the Inspector General should be remedied swiftly. If a contractor is banned from working with the federal government, they should not be the recipient of a federal lease. That's common sense. What is disconcerting, however, is the dedication of this subcommittee's time to discussing a problem that has clear solutions and is actually being addressed. Instead, we should be using this time to solve the challenges affecting the daily lives of Americans. And with that, I'll wrap early and I will yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to our witness panel. I want to remind witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members joining remotely pin the timer so that it remains visible. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Mark Greenblatt, Inspector General for the Department of the Interior, to testify.
Chair Porter, Ranking Member Moore, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'll be discussing our January 2022 report regarding BLM's compliance with federal suspension and debarment regulations. Now, before I dive in, I want to note that this is an excellent example of effective government oversight. Our investigators identified an issue in one matter that they believed could reflect a more widespread problem. So our audit team opened up an inspection and looked at the Bureau's processes on a larger scale. And sure enough, they discovered that this was, in fact, a systemic issue. Now, to its credit, the Bureau took our findings seriously, accepted our recommendations, and took steps to implement them. In fact, the agency is now expanding its efforts to explore whether the problems we identified in BLM in particular, whether that's happening elsewhere in the department. That is how oversight should work. Now, to set the table, our review focused on the intersection of two key issues: BLM's mineral leases on the one hand, and the federal suspension and debarment processes on the other. As you know, BLM issues leases to private entities for energy and mineral exploration and production on federal lands, including oil and gas, coal, helium, renewable energies, and other mineral resources. For a sense of scale, the royalties, rental payments, and bids on these leases in 2020 alone amounted to $5.2 billion in revenue. Now, the other issue in this discussion is the suspension and debarment process, which is commonly called S&D. The S&D process is designed to protect the federal government, federal resources, federal money from fraud, waste, and abuse. In a nutshell, when a federal agency finds that it is doing business with a bad actor or an entity that is not, quote, presently responsible, that's the test under the law, it can suspend or debar that entity. If an entity is suspended or debarred, it is placed on the federal exclusions list. That, in turn, alerts the rest of the federal government to avoid giving those parties more federal money or resources. Executive branch agencies, including the DOI, are required to check whether entities are on the exclusions list before entering into any business relationship with them. In fact, that's the whole point of the exclusions list, to check the list before entering into business relationships with third parties. Now, to that end, the department adopted regulations, policy, guidance that require awarding officials to review the federal exclusions list before issuing awards, including mineral leases or subleases. That is precisely what our inspection examined, whether BLM was in fact checking the exclusions list for suspended and debarred entities before awarding mineral leases. In sum, we found that BLM leasing staff did not check the federal exclusions list before issuing leases. In fact, when we interviewed 29 BLM employees about this, only one of them was aware of the requirement to check the list, and one other employee even knew about the exclusions list existence in the first place. We also found that that even though the department mandated each bureau to have policies and procedures that required such a review, BLM had not implemented a policy or applicable procedures. The federal government established the exclusions list precisely to avoid the possibility of doing business with excluded entities. As I said before, that's the whole point of the S&D process. But if the agencies don't check the list before engaging with entities for contracts or grants, or in this case, leases, the whole construct falls apart. Accordingly, without checking the federal exclusions list before issuing leases, BLM faced an increased risk of issuing leases to suspended or debarred entities, and therefore a heightened risk that our federal resources will face waste, fraud, or abuse. Given our findings, we made 4 recommendations, and BLM concurred with all of them. Since our report was issued, BLM has taken some steps to implement them. For example, on July 8th, BLM issued an instruction memorandum directing staff to review the federal exclusions list and verify eligibility before issuing a lease. And just last week, the department started the process of assessing whether this problem that we identified that's happening in BLM is happening in other components. As I said at the outset, these responses by BLM and the department are positive first steps, and overall, this is an excellent example of how effective government oversight can lead to positive change. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I would now like to recognize Mr. Ned, who is the deputy, sorry, I'm going to get your title exactly right, who is the, I got it right, Deputy Director for Operations for the Bureau of Land Management. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Porter, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the subcommittee. I am Michael Ned, the Bureau of Land Management Deputy Director for Operations. I am pleased to be here to provide testimony on the BLM's suspension and debarment and disqualification policies related to mineral leasing. The BLM manages approximately 245 million surface acres, located primarily in the 12 western states, as well as 30% of the nation's onshore minerals resources across 700 million subsurface acres under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. The BLM's core mission of multiple use and sustained yield provide for a careful balance across many uses and resources in our stewardship of public lands for all people, including renewable energy conventional development, livestock grazing, timber production, hunting and fishing, recreation, wilderness, and conservation. Regarding conventional energy development, the BLMs oversee the federal government's onshore oil and gas program with the goal of facilitating safe and responsible energy development while providing a fair return for the American taxpayer. The Biden administration has made it a priority to reform the federal onshore oil and gas program to ensure that it is operating in the best interests of the American people. In 2021, the department's Office of Inspector General conducted an inspection to determine if the BLM was reviewing potential lessees for their presence on any federal exclusion lists prior to issuing a mineral lease. The OIG reviewed federal minerals lease that the BLM issued between October 1, 2016 through September 30, 2020. The OIG made 4 recommendations in their January 2022 final report and identified 6 lessees that potentially match names on the exclusion list. Upon the release of the report, the BLM took immediate action to implement the OIG's recommendation. The BLM issued interim guidance requiring its leasing staff to immediately review the federal exclusion list to ensure the entity is not federally suspended or debarred before issuing leases, and to document that review in the lease file. On July 8, 2022, the BLM also issued formal guidance restating the required process and outlining new data entry requirement. The formal guidance also states the BLM will internally complete an annual oversight review of the verification of leasing eligibility for the identified transaction. The BLM completed a thorough review of the 6 entities that were mentioned in the OIG report for acquiring leases despite potentially being on the suspension and debarment list. In our review, we researched all lessees that were awarded leases between the same time period covered by the OIG, as well as leases that were issued since October 2020 through June 2022. The BLM found that none of the leases recipient during the time period were excluded from receiving an onshore oil or gas lease, including the 6 lessees identified in the OIG report. With the BLM updated guidance, we believe we have measures in place to ensure proper review of the federal exclusion list moving forward. Further, the BLM is reviewing the exclusion list for all pending leases including those from the recent sale of June 2022, prior to the issuance of any new leases. Finally, the BLM will continue to coordinate review with the Department's suspension and debarment official and the OIG when question arise or additional assistance is needed to determine eligibility. The BLM remains committed to making improvement in the federal oil and gas program and ensuring the program serves the best interests of the American people. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your valuable testimony. Reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. My first question is for Mr. Ned. When you received the Inspector General's report of recommendations and you responded, accepting those recommendations, how long did you say it would take BLM to implement the recommendations?
Madam Chairman, at the time, the BLM estimated it would take somewhere between 19 months to 2 years to implement those recommendations, 2, 3, and 4.
And how long has it actually taken you now that you've been motivated to implement those recommendations?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chairman. It took us a few weeks to assemble a team and respond to recommendation 2 and 3.
And Mr. Ned, I really appreciate that response in those few weeks. It's impressive. It's an example of government doing its job. My concern is if it took a few weeks, if some of it could be done through an email even, why would the Bureau have responded to its own watchdog, whose only purpose is to help it do better work for the American people, saying it would take 1 to 2 years, when the reality clearly available to the Bureau was that the work could be done in a couple weeks?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, once the report was issued in January, we did issue an email implementing interim guidance. The additional week was to formalize those guidance and to ensure our systems was changed. The automated system was changed so the information can be entered into the system. I realized at the time the BLM had a long period, but again, marshaling resources, reshifting priorities, what we did, and implemented 3 of the 4 recommendations.
And like I said, I really commend that, and I think there's an example that you've set here with your response, which is when the Inspector General makes recommendations, I think both sides of the aisle expect the agency to respond as promptly as it can. And I think you've done that here. I think my cautionary reminder to everybody is telling the Inspector General it'll take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 19 months, whatever it is, when it could be done faster, I think doesn't show appropriate recognition of the opportunities that Inspector Generals are handing government officials to deliver for the American people. Now, I want to turn to the Bureau's new policies, again, commending the Bureau and the Department of Interior for its ongoing work in this, to this extent. Right now, if a mineral leasing agent believes that a potential lessee might be on the exclusion list, what information does the leasing agent use to check?
Madam Chairman, they would use if it's an individual, they would use their name and address. If it's a company, they would use the company and all of its executive or principal holder of that company.
Okay, but people can move, people can change their names, the company can change its name, it can form a subsidiary. Why does the Bureau currently require applicants to lease on our public lands to obtain a unique identifying number from SAM.gov or to register at SAM.gov, which is, in part of that registration now is to receive a unique identifying number? Does the Bureau require that?
Madam Chairman, I would have to take that question and get a response for you on the record.
Okay, I would appreciate that. My understanding is that you do not, and in fact that the Bureau's webpage telling potential lease applicants what they need to do does not in fact tell them that they need to go to sam.gov and obtain a unique identifying number. That is a powerful tool to help in this matching process, to help in checking the suspension and disbarment list that I think BLM should be using. Now, if there's a question, if it looks like there might be a match, and the Bureau then has to do more work. They have to call the Interior's Suspension and Disbarment Office. They might have to go back to the original debarring agency. How long does that often take when there's a need to do more checking?
Madam Chairman, it varies. It depends on the unique circumstance, but we have, because of technology and other tools today, we have a direct communication with the debarment, with the Suspension Debarment Office, or if we need to contact with the IG. So I think it varies.
Okay. Do you believe that sam.gov could be improved to make it easier for your employees to check the disbarment list, and how so?
Madam Chairman, we always believe when we're using technology, there's room for improvements, and so we're open to hearing ideas, whether it's from our public or our employees, and we refer those ideas to the department.
I would just say, I would like to, if this list is not working well, I would like you guys to come up with ideas and coordinate with sam.gov, because apparently it's not working. It caused all these problems. The IG found all these issues. So I'm going to yield now to Mr. Moore for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to also reiterate and agree with you that a lot of what is done in our government agencies, and frankly Congress, could be done in an email. So thanks for pointing that out. I want to just reiterate, I'm going to have several different questions today, and again, appreciate the opportunity to speak with both of you and your perspective. But again, appreciate that some of this has been addressed and that we're moving in the right direction. Doing things as timely as possible is important. Inspector General Greenblatt, thanks again for joining us. Before we dive into the details of your report, I'd like to cover an important distinction. Can you describe for us the difference between an inspection, an audit, and an investigation?
That is a critical distinction for us, and I appreciate you flagging it. An investigation relates to individual misconduct by individuals or a group of individuals, violations of law that we are looking for, either criminal, civil, administrative remedies at play. On the other side of the house, so you can think about that side of our operation like a mini FBI. The other side of our operation is the Audit, Inspections, and Evaluations team, which is like a GAO. And this project, this report came out of that team. And the distinction between an audit and an inspection, this was an inspection. It is much more narrowly focused. It is focused on compliance. It is, it's a more nimble, quick-hitting type of program, review, as opposed to an audit, which is much more fulsome, much more robust. I think you can analogize it to a visit to the dentist. An inspection is like your annual checkup. An audit is like a root canal.
How does the inspection, so that's a great clarification, how does an inspection narrow the applicability of your findings? So in other words, does your report provide any indication about the BLM's practices beyond whether employees were checking the federal exclusions list prior to issuing a mineral lease?
No, I mean, this is a rifle shot looking at whether they complied with the regulations, and policy specific to that particular issue.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Mr. Ned, asking a question here about energy development production. The Biden administration continues to hinder domestic energy production, and the American people, this is a quagmire for many of them, particularly my constituents. Your agency continues to stall applications for permits to drill, despite a requirement to issue them in a timely manner. Can you provide a total number of APDs issued by the Bureau of Land Management that were issued within the 30-day time frame required for mineral leasing?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. As I sit here today, I do not have that information. I would be glad to take it back and provide a response for the record.
Right. How many permit applications are currently pending? Do you have that information?
I do not have the exact number here, Ranking Member.
Do you have any, and this is a little bit more of your opinion, so whether you have the actual information or not, can you explain why the BLM did not hold a lease sale for 18 months? Do you have any context related to that?
Yes, Ranking Member. The Bureau received expression of interest, and consistent with the executive orders and consistent with the regulatory process, went through processing it, and once parcels was determined available and eligible for leasing, we held a lease sale, which one was in June.
It was in June. And could you add any additional progress the Bureau's made towards holding the next round of quarterly lease sales?
We have received numerous expression of interest, and we're going through that process again to ensure those lands are available and eligible and suitable for leasing, and we're going through that process now.
Okay. Thank you. You've mentioned the executive orders, which, you know, they suggest we need to not do any of this anymore. We're going to put a moratorium on federal lease sales. But we also hear from President Biden that there is a call for more American oil and gas production. So, again, putting myself in my constituents' shoes, it seems it's very contradictory to what's needed and what's going on. Do you have an opinion on why the Department of Interior instead decreased the land acreage available for leasing by 80% if there is an actual call for increased production?
Ranking member, I can't speak to the department decreasing. We operate based on interest from the public, and I can say since January 2021, we've issued over 5,000 applications for permit to drill, and there's 9,000 that is available out there.
Thank you so much, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair would now like to recognize Mr. Garcia, the gentleman from Illinois, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and of course to the witnesses joining us today. One of the great things about this Inspector General report about the Bureau of Land Management is that it spotlighted so many of the ways that polluters can escape the accountability that comes with having an exclusions list, a list of irresponsible contractors. But the report only focused on one agency, BLM, and one narrow set of transactions with companies or people, oil and gas leases. Naturally, I wonder about the rest of BLM's transactions and the transactions with the rest of the Interior. Mr. Ned, what is BLM doing to understand whether there are sufficient policies and procedures to ensure that exclusions lists are being checked for every procurement or non-procurement transactions?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I can say that BLM is checking for procurement and contracting. The list is being checked, the debarment and suspension list. Last week, after the department issued its policy, I then directed all of our senior managers to check every other area to ensure we're complying.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Greenblatt, do you know how many procurement and non-procurement transactions that Interior and all of its bureaus had in fiscal year 2021?
I don't have that particular number, but I think it's fair to say that the department, and through all of its components, is issuing grants and contracts every day. And the total number of contracts and grants going out the door is about 10 billion roughly every year, and the royalties coming in total, you know, again in the ballpark order of magnitude around 10 billion as well. So you're talking about $20 billion in transactions going in or out the door.
Well, according to USAspending.gov, if we look at only grants and contracts, not leases, bonds, or any other transactions, Interior had 71,000 transactions in fiscal year 2021 alone. That's a lot of potential for bad actors to get contracts if there's no cop on the beat. Mr. Greenblatt, given what you found at BLM, how confident are you that all of Interior, including each of the bureaus, is checking the exclusions list when they're supposed to?
Well, we didn't do the analysis of all the other components, so I'm reticent to opine on what the other components are doing in other contexts. I am very happy that the department then expanded the findings that we made with respect to BLM in this context, and is now looking at them across the board. As I said earlier, I think that's exactly how government oversight should work, where we identify a problem and then the agency takes the ball and runs with it to identify whether that's happening elsewhere. I think that's a positive sign for us.
And finally, do you think it's worth looking into whether interior bureaus have the appropriate policies and procedures in place?
That could be a further step. I think that's part of the department's, continuing efforts. That's one thing where I think we've teed it up for the department now. I think we've exposed the problem, we've identified it and flagged it, and I think it's now sort of the ball is in the court of the department to take the ball and run with it. I think what we could do is, after implementation of these new policies, after they do their review, we can come in and see how things are working out, after they play out a little bit. So I think there is a role for us to play, perhaps, after implementation, to see how how effective that implementation is.
Okay, well, this committee will certainly continue to follow up with Interior to make sure that taxpayers are protected. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to a second round of questions, so I'll recognize myself again for 5 minutes. I just want to return to Mr. Ned quickly on the last point before I move on. Will you commit to requiring BLM applicants for leases on our public lands to register at sam.gov and receive a unique identifying number?
Madam Chairman, what I can say, we've certainly heard you, and I will take that back, and the department will respond with a response for the record.
All right, thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, in your opinion, would that improve BLM's ability to protect taxpayer resources and do the compliance work required?
Well, certainly that's a gap that we identified in our report when we were trying to identify who these 6 entities were and whether they were suspended or debarred. That was certainly a gap that we identified, and I think closing that gap is certainly a good idea, and having a unique identifier that can pinpoint exactly who they are, who the beneficial owners are, would be a good step, whether it's through sam.gov or some other mechanism. We haven't evaluated that, but the concept of closing down that gap so it's not sort of a guessing game, I think that would be certainly would be a clever idea, no question.
Yeah, and I think we saw this from your report, which is you identified potential leases to companies that you believed were on the suspension and disbarment list. After a lot of work, the BLM concluded that they were not, but that is a broken process, and I think we have an opportunity to improve it here.
Yeah, just to clarify, we couldn't tell. They looked like they could have been, but that was part of the problem, and that's the gap that you're identifying. So yes, I think that's exactly a good place to pursue.
So one of the issues we've been talking about now is, checking this list. But the list only works to prevent, this naughty list, as I'm going to call it, only works if we're getting the naughty people put on it. So I want to ask the Bureau about that. Mr. Ned, what is the 17G list?
Madam Chairman, that is a list that identifies individuals who fail to comply or complete reclamation work, and that list is those individuals who are on there.
Okay, so this is a list of people who didn't clean up their messes.
That's a way to put it.
All right, and they're required to. And how many entities right now are on that 17G list?
Madam Chairman, I do not have that number. I know there are a number of them.
Okay, so I do. It's roughly 20, give or take. Have those 20 bad actors, people who failed to do what the law required them to do as a condition for their leases, have they been added to the government-wide suspension and disbarment exclusions list?
Whenever we have an individual like that, we will refer it to the OIG, I believe it's the Administrative Remedy Division, who then work with the SAM official in the department to determine if they would be added. So BLM only makes a referral. It's up to the IG and the other entities to determine if they will be added.
Has BLM made the referral of every company on the 17G list to the OIG to begin that process?
I believe we've made some. I cannot speak definitively if we've recommended 20 as you mentioned.
How long can a company linger on the 17G list? How frequently are those referrals made?
Well, once we discover a bad actor, we do make that referral. And so when the staff discovered it in the field, or it's moved up to the headquarters office, and we begin that process immediately.
So your representation is that companies when they get put on, when there's an issue and they go on this internal 17G list, that it is a automatic and fairly immediate, let's say within a month or two, you get it referred to the OIG to begin that SAM exclusion list process?
I don't want to say it's an automatic or a month or two. I know we have a process. Madam Chairman, I can get back with a response. What is that exact time frame? It varies, but I can respond for the record.
Because I have concerns that companies may be sitting on this 17G list for years. I believe that now the BLM has made these referrals to the OIG to begin its work with SAM, but I'm concerned that the 17G list was sitting there. I mean, it's like someone making a list of, parents making a list of who's naughty and nice and never getting it to Santa by Christmas. It's important to get it to OIG so they can do that work in a timely fashion. Mr. Greenblatt, how long is it going to take you, now that you do have these names, to work through that and decide whether they should be added to SAM.gov?
So our role in this breaks down into two basic ways. One is if there is an offense. So for example, if there's a criminal indictment, if there is a civil action, if there is some finding that these entities, a conviction engaged in misconduct, that is much more rapid. The other process for S&D is called fact-based, and that is much more robust. That is effectively investigating who these entities are and whether they are presently responsible. That's the term under the law. That's a heavy lift, so that can take a long time. That's building the case just like a prosecution would build a case. So that's much more robust. I would say this, on these matters, my belief is that the agency should be taking ownership of this process, not the OIG. Now, the OIG is authorized under the law, under the regs to do so. But this is really a program execution issue. This should be BLM or one of the other one of the other components in the agency that is taking the lead on creating these referrals and then taking it to the suspension and debarment official, who's excellent. She is a treasure for all of us, but she only has, as you mentioned, 2 people, and so there's a robust docket for her. So I think that the department needs to be dedicating some resources to handle these 17G cases and all of the other components. We can do the cases that come up through the IG investigations, but for these ones that are coming from the components, it really should be a program execution issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moore?
Thank you. And I'll again reiterate that very good with the naughty and nice list, getting to the right people. I'm very big on that. I have 4 boys, 9 and under, so we definitely implement that prior to Christmas time. The point that I want to make, and I do want to make a quick statement with no question associated, is that I want to just highlight that it is very important as that list is developed, that it remains apolitical, and it's something that we'll be watching closely with the takeover of so much of ESG related political push to infiltrate some of these decisions. Keep that list apolitical. We will do our part to hold you accountable respectfully, but keep that list apolitical so you can base those decisions on what is required. And then I will be the first one to show up and say, look, if it's done correctly, then we're okay with you, with the exclusionary list. So just want to make that statement. Let me jump into something that's very, very important to Utahns. A few years ago, we saw the Great American Outdoors Act pass Congress in bipartisan support. And I have joined my colleagues in May and June of 2022 in writing a letter to Secretary Haaland expressing concerns about the Interior Department's use of legacy restoration funds and management of the deferred maintenance backlog. This is something that a lot of my constituents are focused on. Can you describe, Mr. Greenblatt, can you describe the oversight your office is conducting on the Great American Outdoors Act, legacy restoration funding, or the deferred maintenance backlog, or all three, even better?
Absolutely. Deferred maintenance is, obviously these issues are big ticket items for us. Deferred maintenance, GOA, these are headline issues for us. We identified them as top management challenges for the department. We have been putting our resources toward oversight in that regard. We issued a report in March, just a few months ago, related to the department's planning and execution of the GOA program, and identified some gaps. We also have 2 other jobs, one of which is being written right now as I speak related to NPS's execution of their deferred maintenance funds, their prioritization, and things along those lines. That is being drafted right now. It takes a couple of months for the whole process to work out, but that should be on the street soon. And then we're also doing a job on BIE related to their deferred maintenance efforts. That's going to be, later, a little bit later in the queue, but that's lined up. And then we also have another job related to cost overruns. So these are contracts under GOA where they estimate the cost will be, say, $100. I'm making that up, but say $100. But then at the end of the day, it goes to $200, $300, $400. The question is why? Why did we get that so wrong at the beginning? Is there something going on there? And because that blows up all of your estimates. So there are 4 jobs. One's done, one's in writing, one's in the queue, and then the ones after that.
Thank you. These programs have a big potential for how would you say, foul play, and we don't want to see any favorites played in this situation. While as Utahns we understand that our national parks are the favorite of the country, we really, really want to make sure that this is done in a proper manner, and we're going to continue to keep an eye on that as we've been heavily focused on it for the last couple of years. Mr. Ned, I think everybody can agree that critical minerals play a crucial role in our economy. Look at all of the renewable technology that needs critical minerals to be able to exist and to thrive. The demand is going to continue to go up. Can you justify your agency's continued obstruction of mineral development as their demand continues to grow, forcing our nation to rely on foreign sources that don't adhere to the same labor standards that we do? Right? We are literally, approaching the Department of Congo with horrible practices, child labor practices, while we are obstructing what we're doing here on our own in our homeland. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. We're certainly processing requests as they come in, and my records show that since January 2021, we've approved 20 mine either on modification or expansion. And so, again, it's a process we go through, and we have been working diligently to process those.
Been a key focus of the Natural Resources Committee, the entire committee, and continues to be that focus, and we want to be able to develop a relationship where there's transparency on what we're doing with respect to those mineral leases. Last quick question, Mr. Greenblatt, very concerned about the BLM's failure to hold quarterly leases and timely issues of APDs. Is this your issue's office jurisdiction to examine?
We could look at compliance with, executive orders, regulations, whatever it is. So yes, theoretically, I think it could be, depending on exactly how it's framed.
Any idea, how could we work together to make sure we continue to move forward in the right direction?
I recognize that's a significant issue for you personally, for the committee, for the public. So I'm happy to engage with you and discuss how we can add value, we in the OIG can add value to that discussion. And, we're always looking to to hit high priority areas, high risk areas. So if that's something of interest to the committee, I'm happy to engage with you, sit down with you, have our staff sit down and talk it through.
Would love to. 1320 Longworth is open door policy.
Great.
So we'll follow up. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. If Mr. Moore will indulge me, I have one more round of questions, if that would be acceptable. And I'm going to refrain for political reasons from commenting on which state has the best national parks. I wanted to ask about this new guidance, Mr. Ned, that you have issued, and again, commending you for doing that. That guidance says, quote, in situations where the Bureau identifies bad actors, the Bureau should make a referral to OIG, the Inspector General's Administrative and Remedies Division, and provide evidence of the entity's offense or serious poor performance. How will you ensure that your leasing agents are making determinations consistently across the Bureau, that what a leasing agent in Utah maybe says is serious poor performance is the same as what a leasing agent in California might say is serious poor performance? How do we know these bad actors when we see them?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Certainly in whatever is the governing document, whether it's a lease or an agreement, it dictates the terms for the bad actor or the terms for them to govern by. If they fail to govern by those terms, then it will be reported. We're having constant calls monthly, quarterly, we're having discussions. So information and ideas and best practices are being shared. We've laid out a process, and it's now educating our staff and ensuring everyone understands what's going on and having the ability to report that.
Mr. Ned, could you give a clear example of what would be seriously poor performance or what would land somebody on the BLM's bad actor list?
Well, I think failing to pay your bid or the bid money, failing to pay the bonus payment. I think someone failing to follow through on the agreement to complete reclamation. So I think these are things that show poor, or someone is engaging in some sort of activity that may not be appropriate. So I think there are many examples, but we're looking to see, are you following through on your commitment and your words by the terms of the agreement or the contract?
Okay. I wanted to mention that there has been in referral, someone has made a petition. The Pace Environmental Law Clinic has made a petition to the Administrative and Remedies Division with regard to ExxonMobil. And before I go into this, I just want to emphasize, what Mr. Moore said. We expect all the work of the Inspector General to continue its apolitical, nonpartisan work. But the facts laid out in that petition, I think, warrant real investigation about debarment. The exclusions list doesn't include a company that has committed really serious offenses, and accrued fines totaling billions of dollars. If that doesn't get you on the debarment list, what does? Mr. Greenblatt?
Well, I can't comment on any particular matter at issue, be it that one or any other. But our review looks at their performance, as Mr. Ned said, their performance, under the terms of the lease or whatever the contract is. That's the key. If they are presently responsible for executing their responsibilities under that lease, that'll make it a little more difficult to pursue an S&D action. But that's the key: is are they presently responsible to perform their obligations under?
So if they have, say, in the case of ExxonMobil, 110 past instances of misconduct and have done things in the past that has accrued over $3 billion of fines, does that land? What point do we stop going back to the same actors that then fail to be, even if they look like they're being presently responsible? Clearly they're not sometimes, because they wouldn't have these misconduct situations and these fine situations. And I don't mean to pick on this one. I'm using this one company intentionally as an example, but I assume that this is a problem present in lots of different types and sizes of companies.
Yeah, I think this is an issue, across government, where you have a number of, larger entities that may be having, issues spread across government, but not enough maybe concentrated to move forward with an S&D in one particular agency. Again, I can't speak to that one entity in particular. But if it does, the test under the law is, whether they're presently responsible, and the key question is, whether they can perform their responsibilities, and that's the analysis that my team engages on. And just to get back to that other issue, I can commit to you right here on the record under oath that my team operates in a completely apolitical, nonpartisan fashion. You all can rest assured that does not. I don't countenance that, and my team doesn't do it.
Yeah, and I see Mr. Moore nodding along, and I think we want to make sure the American public heard you say that, because we do, and we appreciate it. Mr. Moore?
Thank you. I'll just two remaining questions for each of our witnesses today. Again, thank you for being here. And let me reiterate, Mr. Ned, look, we evaluated this, and the content of today's subcommittee hearing was very clear. There was a mistake. The IG stepped in, provided direction, and you're implementing it. So thank you. We encourage you to do it as timely as fast as possible. And we'll continue to work with you in a respectful way to make sure these things are done appropriately. A question that comes directly from my governor. One of the key things that I learned, I wasn't involved in a lot of land management, public land, that wasn't part of my career prior to my role in Congress. One thing that I've learned about my state is that we try very, very hard to work with our federal agencies. We develop MOUs. You can look at our shared stewardship agreements. We have a vested interest in making sure that Utah's land is addressed, in the best way possible. And so I have seen a sincere effort from our end to make sure we work well with the department, regardless of who's in the White House. The BLM's decisions, they do impact our home states, particularly, with what I understand and what I've seen firsthand in Utah. So I encourage you to work with members of our communities. Can you tell us what the Bureau is doing to better cooperate with states in deferring to state-specific plans, like for sage grouse is an example in Utah, rather than more region-specific or just top-down approaches?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I can speak from experience serving as a state director. Really reaching out and engaging the state official, whether it's at the DNR, whether it's at the wildlife divisions, and its relationship. I think this administration have emphasized, like others, that we need to engage community, engage governors, engage tribe, engage everyone. And so I think I can speak for Utah. Our state director there, Greg Sheehan, is doing an excellent job in reaching out and engaging.
Greg Sheehan is doing, he contacts me frequently, and there are areas that I could pinpoint and I could, that we do have a very positive relationship, like I mentioned with the shared stewardships, and there's areas that we are very frustrated with. And so I just want to encourage you and with your colleagues to continue to push that. Assume best intent from our state, because I've seen it firsthand. That's what we're doing. The governor's team is exceptional. They have some of the best professionals working with them, and I feel like my role here is just to make sure their voice is heard with the administration as much as possible. It's not easy when it's the opposing parties in the White House. And I wish that weren't the case, but we want to continue as much as we can to get over those political hurdles. Just last final question, Mr. Greenblatt. The Interior Department received hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure funding. What are you doing to provide insight or oversight of this funding and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yeah, thank you. We just like the GOA question, the Greater American Outdoors Act that we spoke about a minute ago, we have a robust plan designed to attack it both from the audit side, that's the mini GAO side, and then from the investigation side, the mini FBI side. We have a number of different focal points. One is orphaned wells. We just issued our first flash report on orphaned wells, I think it was yesterday. And so we're trying to get out ahead of it. We have 4 flash reports coming that are proactive in nature, trying to advise the agency in advance. These are some lessons that we've learned in other contexts. You can learn those lessons as you're moving forward on infrastructure. So we have 4 of those: orphaned wells, abandoned mines, Western water, ecosystem restoration is another one, BIA roads is another focal point. So those are some of the big categories that we're looking at. But we are, hiring additional investigators, hiring additional auditors, that are going to have that as part of their regular docket.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move to my closing statement. I think today has been a success story in several regards. First, I want to thank the ranking member and our respective staffs and teams. I think this has been an excellent example of how we can work together across the aisle to make sure that government is delivering on the laws that we have. It is important to protect taxpayers from waste, fraud, and abuse. It is important to enforce the law as it is written. There's a process for us to change the law and debate the law, but when it's written, it's important that all Americans can rely on it being enforced, and I think that this has been an example of that. I thank the OIG for their incredible work in undertaking this investigation. It's exciting to hear that you are continuing to do your work in that nonpartisan way. I thank Mr. Ned for being willing to take action on the OIG's recommendations. I commend you for initially accepting them and then being willing to accelerate your timeline for implementation. I think there's more opportunity here. I think the exclusions list, and frankly, I have been registered on SAM.gov, and I'm going to be honest, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about how to make SAM.gov work better, a lot of opportunity to think about how to make this exclusions list work better, and I want to encourage Mr. Ned to come to us if there's legislative fixes that are needed, to take a real leadership continue to take a leadership role in Interior in doing this. I think there are lessons from today that other agencies who have to use the exclusion list should be looking at and thinking about in terms of improving their compliance. I think there are remaining loopholes, the definition of bad actor, what it means to be presently responsible. Again, wanting that to be a nonpartisan and fair and thoughtful system. I think there's an awful lot of discretion in the system that could go too far in one direction or the other. So I'd like to think about better guidance on that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and thank the witnesses, both of you again, for your valuable testimony. We don't get always chances to see government working well, and I think that's what this was, an opportunity to do better and government stepping up to deliver it. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we're going to ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, then without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.